This is HOA clapback. I did not raise my voice. I raised my evidence packet. I care what the policy says. That is what Shirley Gray screamed at me the first time, standing in the Pinecrest Village Landing Association entrance lane with her phone aimed at my friend's car like she was documenting a felony. My friend had parked in a guest spot to carry in 4 bags of groceries because I had just gotten home from a 12-hour shift and my fridge was empty. Shirley appeared within 90 seconds, lanyard swinging, visor low, timing the visit like she had been hiding behind a palm tree with a stopwatch. I am a municipal code researcher. I read ordinances for fun, which makes me the worst possible target for someone who invents guidelines on the fly. I live in Naples, Florida, in a neighborhood where gray areas equal HOA power grabs, and Shirley Gray is the community standards chair who turned guest parking into a weapons program. She held up her phone. Smile, I am documenting this for the file. That was her catchphrase, delivered with a grin that made my teeth hurt. My friend looked at me. I waved him off. He handed me the bags and left. Shirley kept filming until his taillights cleared the gate. Then she turned to me. Your guest did not display a permit. I said he was here for 5 minutes. She said the addendum requires a decal for any vehicle in a guest space. No exceptions. I said, show me the addendum. She said it is in the file, and you will get a certified letter. That was 3 weeks ago. The certified letter arrived 6 days later, demanding $250 in fines and referencing a parking addendum I had never seen. I went to the clubhouse and asked for a copy. The desk attendant said she would check with Shirley. I waited. Shirley never answered. I sent an email. No reply. I sent a formal records request under Florida statute, citing the specific section that requires HOAs to provide governing documents within 10 business days. Shirley replied with a one-liner saying the board would discuss it at the next meeting. I did not wait. I pulled the association's filed documents from the county clerk and searched for any parking addendum. Nothing. I checked the board meeting minutes for the last 2 years. No adoption vote. I sent Shirley a follow-up email with screenshots and asked her to clarify which meeting adopted the addendum. She replied, the board has discretion to interpret rules as needed for community safety. That is when I knew this was not about safety. This was about control. Shirley had decided guest parking was her turf, and she was going to turn it into a revenue stream and a harassment lever. I started keeping a log. Every time a guest visited, I photographed the car, the timestamp, the duration, and the surrounding spaces. I told my neighbors to do the same. Within a week, I had 12 entries showing guest visits under 15 minutes with no violations, no complaints, and no towing. Shirley sent me another letter, this time claiming I was in arrears and threatening a lien. I called an attorney. He laughed when I read him the letter. He said the addendum does not exist, the fine is unenforceable, and the lien threat is probably a bluff. But HOAs do this all the time because most people just pay to make it go away. He said if I wanted to fight it, I would need to document everything, get witness statements, and be ready for escalation. I said I was already documenting. He said good, because people like Shirley do not stop until someone makes them. 2 days later, my friend came back to drop off a drill I had lent him. He parked in the same guest spot. I was inside when I heard Shirley's voice outside, sharp and loud. I walked out and found her standing beside his car, holding a tablet and tapping the screen like she was filing a lawsuit in real time. Your guest is in violation again. I said he is dropping off a tool. He will be gone in 2 minutes. She said 2 minutes is still a visit, and visits require a permit. I said, show me the rule. She pointed at the tablet. I have the policy right here. I stepped closer. She angled the screen away. Make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed. That was her exact line. delivered with a smirk that made me want to document it on the spot. I did not chase her accusations, because I already had the receipts. I had neighbor witness statements with same-day photos and identical lighting, showing her marking cars with chalk at night, and then claiming they had been parked overnight. I had timestamps proving she was the one fabricating violations. I was not going to hand her anything until the right moment. My friend left. Shirley stayed in the lane for another 10 minutes, filming the empty space. I watched from my window. She finally walked away, but 20 minutes later a white pickup with amber lights pulled into the lot. The driver got out, walked to my car, which was parked legally in my assigned space, and took a photo of my license plate. I went outside. He said he was with the towing company contracted by the association. I asked why he was photographing my car. He said he was doing a sweep for violations. I said my car is in my assigned space with my resident decal visible. He shrugged and said he was just following the list. I asked to see the list. He said it was internal. I asked who gave him the list. He said the HOA manager. I asked for the manager's contact. He got back in his truck and left. I took photos of his truck, his plate, the company name on the door, and the timestamp. Then I sent an email to the HOA board with copies to the management company, asking for clarification on the towing vendor contract, the criteria for placing a vehicle on a tow list, and the process for resident notification. No reply. The next week, my attorney told me he needed one more document to finalize a demand letter, and he needed it today. I went back to the clubhouse. The desk attendant said Shirley was not available. I said I was not asking for Shirley. I was asking for a public record under Florida statute. She said she would pass the message along. I waited in the lobby. 30 minutes later, Shirley walked in with a clipboard and 2 volunteers wearing reflective vests with Pinecrest Village Landing Association printed across the back. She looked at me. "You are trespassing." I said I am a resident requesting records in a common area. She said the clubhouse is closed for maintenance. I looked around. The lights were on, the door was unlocked, and 3 other residents were sitting in the lounge. She turned to the volunteers. "I need you to document this." They pulled out their phones. I pulled out mine. Shirley stepped closer. "You are harassing staff." I said I am standing in the lobby waiting for a document the law requires you to provide. She said the law does not apply here. This is private property. I said HOAs are subject to Florida Statute Chapter 720, and you have 10 business days to comply with a records request, and today is day 9. One of the volunteers lowered his phone. He looked at Shirley. "Is that true?" She snapped at him. "Do not engage with him. He is trying to bait us." The other volunteer whispered something to him, and they both took a step back. Shirley turned to me. "Fine. You want documents? I will make sure you get every document we have, and you can pay the copying fee up front." I said the statute caps fees at 15 cents per page, and you cannot require prepayment for records requests. She said we will see what the board says. Then she walked out, volunteers trailing behind her, and the desk attendant handed me a slip of paper with a meeting date 2 weeks away. If you are enjoying this chaos, hit like and subscribe for more stories where HOA Karens get what they deserve. I left the clubhouse and called my attorney. He said Shirley was stalling, and the records denial was grounds for a state procedure complaint that forces the HOA to respond. He drafted the complaint that afternoon. I filed it the next morning. The state acknowledgement email arrived within an hour, and I forwarded it to the HOA board with a note saying I hoped we could resolve this without further escalation. Shirley replied within 5 minutes. "You just made this worse for yourself. The board will be discussing your conduct at the next meeting. and we will be voting on additional fines for frivolous complaints. I forwarded her email to my attorney. He said threats like that are evidence of retaliation, and I should keep everything she sends. 3 days later, the gate glitched when I was driving in. I sat there for 90 seconds waiting for it to reset. When it finally opened, Shirley was standing on the other side with her phone out. "You were trespassing." I said the gate malfunctioned and I was waiting for it to open. She said, "You sat there without authorization, and I am filing a complaint with the county." I said the gate is operated by the HOA, and if it malfunctions, that is the HOA's problem, not mine. She said we will let the police decide. Then she walked to her car, got in, and drove away. I sat in my driveway and waited. 30 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy pulled up. I walked out. He said he had received a call about someone trespassing at the gate. I explained the glitch, showed him my resident decal, and pulled up the gate logs on my phone showing the 90-second delay. He looked at the logs, nodded, and said it sounded like a malfunction, not a trespass. He asked if there was an ongoing dispute. I said yes, and I gave him a 2-minute summary. He said he could not do anything about civil HOA issues, but he would note in his report that there was no criminal activity. He left. I sent a copy of his report to my attorney. The meeting ambush happened 2 nights later. I showed up at the clubhouse at 7 for the monthly board meeting. Shirley was already there, sitting at the head table with the board president and 2 other board members. The president called the meeting to order and said they had added an agenda item to discuss my conduct. I said I was not notified of any agenda changes, and Florida law requires reasonable notice. The president said notice was posted on the website. I checked my phone. The website had not been updated in 6 days. Shirley stood up. "We are here because this resident has been harassing staff, filing frivolous complaints, and creating a hostile environment in the community." She pulled out a folder and started reading a list of alleged violations: guest parking without permits, trespassing at the gate, verbal abuse of volunteers, failure to comply with records requests. Every single item was either false or twisted. I raised my hand. The president said I would have a chance to respond. Shirley kept reading. When she finished, she said, "I move that we fine this resident $500 for conduct violations and place a hold on his records requests pending resolution." The board president said, "Is there a second?" One of the board members, a man in his 60s who had been watching the whole thing with a neutral expression, raised his hand halfway. The president said, "Motion is seconded. Now we will hear from the resident." I stood up. I said, "Everything Shirley just said is false, and I have documentation proving it." I pulled out my tabbed evidence binder and held it up. The president said, "We do not need to see that now." I said, "You are about to vote on a $500 fine based on false allegations, and you are refusing to look at evidence?" Shirley cut in. "He is wasting our time. Let's vote." I raised my voice. I said, "If you vote without reviewing evidence, I will file a complaint with the state, and I will name every board member personally." The room went quiet. The board president looked at the other members. One of them, a woman in her 50s, said, "Maybe we should look at the documents." Shirley said, "We do not have time for this." The woman said, "We have time." The president sighed and said, "Fine, show us what you have." I walked to the front and opened the binder. I showed them the neighbor witness statements, the photos with timestamps, the chalk marks, the gate logs, and the email thread where Shirley refused to provide the parking addendum. I showed them the sheriff's report clearing me of trespassing. I showed them the state complaint I had filed. I said, "This is not about guest parking. This is about retaliation. because I asked for public records. Shirley stood up. Her face was red. She said, "He is twisting everything. He is the one harassing us." I said, "I have recordings." I pulled out my phone and played the audio from the clubhouse lobby, where she accused me of trespassing and threatened to escalate. The board president held up his hand. He said, "I think we need to table this until we can review everything." Shirley said, "Are you serious?" He said, "I am serious. Motion is tabled." Shirley grabbed her folder and walked out. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but she did not come back. When it ended, the board member who had been watching silently walked up to me. He said, "I have been on this board for 3 years, and I have never seen her produce an actual addendum." "I think you are right." I said, "Can you help me get the records?" He said, "I will try." 2 days later, Shirley sent a new letter. This one claimed I owed $700 in accumulated fines, and that the association was authorized to place a lien on my property if I did not pay within 10 days. My attorney read it and said it was garbage. He said the fine was not enforceable because the underlying violations were fabricated, and the lien threat was illegal under Florida law because the board had not voted on it. He drafted a response and sent it to the entire board, copying the management company. The response included a demand for the parking addendum, the towing vendor contract, and the board meeting minutes where the fine policy was adopted. The management company replied first. They said they were reviewing the matter and would respond within 5 business days. Shirley replied next. She said, "Your attorney does not scare me. The board will meet in executive session to discuss your violations, and you will not be invited." My attorney forwarded her email to the state investigator handling my records complaint. The executive session happened 3 days later. I found out about it because the board member who had spoken to me after the meeting sent me a text. He said, "They are meeting tonight without you, and Shirley is trying to push through a vote to authorize towing for any vehicle without a guest permit, effective immediately." I said, "Can they do that?" He said, "Not legally, but she is going to try." I showed up at the clubhouse. The board president was standing outside. He said, "This is a closed session." I said, "Florida law requires executive sessions to be limited to specific topics, and rule enforcement is not one of them." He said, "We are discussing personnel matters." I said, "I am not personnel, I am a resident, and if you vote on anything that affects me, I have a right to be present." He said, "I will pass that along." Then he went inside and locked the door. I waited outside for 40 minutes. When the door opened, Shirley walked out first. She saw me and stopped. She said, "You are pathetic." I said, "Did you vote?" She said, "None of your business." Then she got in her car and left. The board member who had texted me came out last. He said, "She tried to push the tow vote. It failed. 2 of us voted no, and the president abstained." I said, "What happens now?" He said, "I do not know, but she is not done." He was right. The next morning, I woke up to a tow truck idling in the guest lot. I looked out the window and saw a wheel lift backing up to my friend's car. He had stayed over after helping me install a ceiling fan, and his car was in a guest spot with no permit because I had never been given one to issue. I ran outside. The tow driver was attaching the wheel lift to the front axle. I said, "Stop." He said, "I have authorization from the HOA." I said, "Show me." He pulled out a printed sheet with Shirley's name at the bottom and a list of plate numbers. My friend's plate was on the list. I said, "That car belongs to a guest who is staying with me, and the HOA has no authority to tow a guest vehicle without notice." He said, "I am just doing my job." I pulled out my phone and started recording. I said, "If you tow this car, I will file a complaint with the state, and I will name you personally." He stopped. He said, "I do not want any trouble." I said, "Then do not tow the car until you verify the authorization is legal." He looked at the sheet, then at me, then at the car. He said, "I will call my dispatcher." He called. I heard him say, "The owner is saying the authorization is not legal, and he is recording me." There was a pause. Then he said, "Okay." He hung up and said, "My dispatcher says I need written confirmation from the HOA manager before I proceed." I said, "Good." He unhooked the wheel lift and drove away. I went back inside and called my attorney. He said that was close, and Shirley had just exposed herself to serious liability because Florida law prohibits HOAs from towing guest vehicles without proper notice and a hearing. He said if they tried again, I should let them tow the car and then sue for wrongful towing, but he recommended I prevent the tow if possible because fighting it after the fact is messy. That afternoon, I got an email from the board member who had been helping me. He said, "I found something. The parking addendum Shirley keeps citing was drafted 3 years ago, but it was never voted on. The board minutes show the draft was tabled indefinitely because 2 members raised concerns about enforcement costs. It has been sitting in a draft folder ever since. Shirley has been treating it like law, but it is not." I forwarded the email to my attorney. He said, "That is your smoking gun. If the rule was never adopted, every fine and every tow thread is invalid." He drafted a formal demand letter citing the draft status and sent it to the board, the management company, and Shirley personally. The letter demanded an immediate refund of all fines, a public retraction of the towing threats, and a written acknowledgement that the parking addendum is not enforceable. Shirley replied within an hour. She said, "The board has the authority to enforce community standards even without a formal vote." My attorney replied, "No, they do not. Florida Statute 720 is clear. Rules must be adopted through a recorded vote at a properly noticed meeting. Your addendum does not exist." The board president sent an email later that day. He said, "The board will meet in 2 weeks to discuss the parking policy and determine next steps." He did not mention refunds or retractions. My attorney said that was not good enough. He said if they did not respond with a concrete offer within 5 days, he would file a lawsuit. Shirley tried one more escalation. She sent an email to every resident in the community saying that I was under investigation for multiple violations, and that anyone who allowed me to use their guest parking would also be subject to fines. My attorney said that was defamation, and it opened her up to personal liability. He drafted a cease and desist letter and sent it to her directly, with a copy to her personal email address. The letter said that if she sent any more false statements, he would file a lawsuit naming her individually, not just the HOA. She did not reply. But 2 days later, my friend came over again to help me move furniture. He parked in the guest lot. Within 10 minutes, Shirley appeared with a tow truck right behind her. The truck had a tire clamp visible in the bed and a tow hook chain hanging from the wheel lift. Shirley pointed at my friend's car. "That vehicle is in violation." The driver got out and walked toward the car. I stepped in front of him. I said, "You are about to make a very expensive mistake." He stopped. I pulled out my phone and showed him the email thread proving the parking addendum was never adopted. I said, "If you tow this car, I will sue you and your company for wrongful towing under Florida statute, and I will win." He looked at the email, then at Shirley. He said, "Is this true?" She said, "Do not listen to him. He is lying." I said, "Call your dispatcher again." He pulled out his phone and stepped away. Shirley turned to me. "You think you are so smart." I said, "I think you have been breaking the law for 3 years, and now you are going to pay for it." She said, "Make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed." I smiled. I said, "I already did." I pulled out my phone and played the audio I had recorded at the board meeting 2 weeks earlier. It was the section where the board member confirmed the addendum was never adopted. Shirley's face went white. I said, "I sent this to the state investigator yesterday." She said, "You are bluffing." I said, "Try me." The tow driver came back. He said, "My dispatcher says I need written authorization from the HOA manager and proof that the rule is valid." He looked at Shirley. She did not say anything. He got back in his truck and left. Shirley stood there for a moment staring at me. Then she turned and walked away. I watched her get in her car. She sat there for 5 minutes before driving off. The board meeting happened the next week. I showed up early. Shirley was already there, sitting at the head table, but she did not look at me. The board president opened the meeting and said they had received my attorney's demand letter and the state investigator's preliminary report. He said the board had reviewed the parking addendum and confirmed that it had never been formally adopted. He said the board was voting tonight to rescind all fines related to guest parking and to suspend enforcement of the addendum pending a full policy rewrite. Shirley stood up. She said, "This is a mistake. We need strict parking rules to maintain order." The board president said, "We need legal parking rules, and what we had was not legal." He called for a vote. The motion passed 4-1. Shirley was the only no vote. Then the president said, "There is one more item. The board has received a complaint about conduct violations and harassment by a board member. The complaint was filed by a resident and supported by witness statements from other residents. The board has determined that the complaint has merit, and we are voting tonight to remove the individual from their leadership position and place them on probation pending further review." Shirley's face went red. She said, "Who filed the complaint?" The president said, "That is confidential." She said, "This is retaliation." He said, "The vote is recorded and public." The motion passed 4-1 again. Shirley stood up, grabbed her folder, and walked out. She did not come back. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes. When it ended, the board president walked up to me. He said, "I apologize for what you went through. This should never have happened." I said, "I appreciate that." He said, "We are going to do better." The state investigator's final report came out 2 weeks later. It confirmed that the parking addendum had never been adopted, that Shirley had issued fines and tow orders without authority, and that the HOA had violated Florida statute by denying my records requests. The investigator recommended that the HOA refund all fines, issue a public apology, and implement mandatory training for board members on records compliance and rule enforcement. The HOA complied within 30 days. My attorney filed a separate complaint with the county about the towing company's practices. The county found that the company had accepted tow orders from Shirley without verifying that the orders were legal, and they fined the company for improper towing practices. The company dropped its contract with the HOA. Shirley resigned from the board a month later. I heard from another resident that she tried to run for re-election the following year, but she lost by a landslide. The new board rewrote the parking policy with input from residents, and they added a clause requiring any enforcement action to include written notice, a hearing, and documented proof of the violation. I still live in Pinecrest Village Landing, and I still read ordinances for fun. But now, every time I see a guest car in the lot, I smile, because I know the rules are real and the enforcement is fair. And if anyone ever tries to pull what Shirley pulled, I have a binder full of receipts and a phone full of recordings, and I am ready to use them. The final showdown happened 3 months later. Shirley had been quiet since her resignation, but one afternoon I saw her standing in the community entrance lane with her phone out, filming cars as they came through the gate. I pulled over and rolled down my window. I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I am documenting traffic violations." I said, "You are not on the board anymore." She said, "I am still a resident, and I have a right to protect this community." I said, "You do not have a right to harass people." She said, "I am not harassing anyone. I am gathering evidence." I said, "Evidence of what?" She said, "Violations." I said, "Name one." She pointed at a car pulling into the guest lot. That car does not have a permit. I said, "There is no permit requirement anymore." The board rewrote the policy. She said, "I know what the policy says, and I know what it should say." I got out of my car. I said, "This ends now." She said, "You do not get to tell me what to do." I said, "I do not have to. A judge already did." I pulled out my phone and showed her the temporary restraining order my attorney had filed that morning. It barred her from ordering any towing action, from photographing or filming residents or guests without consent, and from making any enforcement decisions on behalf of the HOA. The order was effective immediately and would remain in place until the court hearing in 2 weeks. Shirley read the order. Her face went pale. She said, "You cannot do this." I said, "I just did." She said, "The board will appeal." I said the board supported the order. She looked at me. She said, "You ruined everything." I said, "You did that yourself." She got in her car and left. I stood there for a moment, watching her taillights disappear past the gate. Then I got back in my car and drove home. 2 weeks later, the court hearing happened. Shirley did not show up. The judge made the restraining order permanent and ordered the HOA to freeze enforcement pending a policy rewrite. The HOA complied. The new policy included clear procedures, written notice requirements, and an appeals process that gave residents the right to challenge any enforcement action before it resulted in fines or towing. At the hearing, the judge played a recording I had submitted as evidence. It was from the executive session where Shirley had tried to push through the tow vote. The recording captured her saying, "I do not care what the policy says. We need to make an example of him." When the judge played it on speaker, the courtroom went silent. The judge looked at the HOA attorney and said, "This is the person you put in charge of enforcement?" The attorney said nothing. The judge ruled in my favor on every count. Karen quotes minutes and the actual minutes contradict her. That was the funny karma beat that sealed it. Shirley had claimed in multiple emails that the board had voted to adopt the parking addendum at a meeting in March 2022. I pulled the actual minutes from that meeting. There was no parking item on the agenda, no discussion, and no vote. When my attorney showed the minutes to the judge, Shirley tried to argue that it had been an informal vote. The judge said informal votes are not votes, and the case was closed. After the hearing, the board member who had helped me walked up and shook my hand. He said, "I am glad you fought this. A lot of people would have just paid the fines and moved on." I said, "I am a municipal code researcher. I do not move on, I dig in." He laughed and said, "I can tell." The HOA froze enforcement pending a policy rewrite, and the entire community got a chance to weigh in. The new policy passed with overwhelming support, and the board implemented mandatory training for anyone in a leadership position. Shirley never came to another meeting. Karen got embarrassed when her own quote played on speaker. That was the moment she lost. The recording of her saying, "Make it public," I love watching people get embarrassed played during the final board meeting where the new policy was adopted. A resident asked the board president to play it so everyone could hear what she had said about accountability. He did. The room erupted in murmurs. Shirley was not there, but everyone knew who it was. She never showed her face in the clubhouse again. I still see her around the neighborhood sometimes. She does not make eye contact. She does not film cars. She does not leave notes on windshields. She stays in her unit, and I stay in mine, and the community moves forward without her chaos. I learned a lot from this fight. I learned that HOAs can be weaponized by people who crave control, but they can also be reformed by residents who refuse to back down. I learned that documentation is everything, that Florida Statute 720 is your best friend, and that attorneys who specialize in HOA law are worth every penny. I learned that a state procedure complaint that forces the HOA to respond is not just a tool, it is a lifeline. And I learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to make them face the consequences of their own actions in front of everyone they tried to intimidate. Now, every time a guest parks in the lot, I take a photo and send it to the board member who helped me. He sends back a thumbs up emoji. The new policy is working. The towing company is gone. The fines are refunded. The tire clamps are in storage, and the tow hook chains are rusting in a yard somewhere. And Shirley Gray is a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks they can invent rules and terrorize residents without facing the law. Until next time, keep your paper trail.